Chapter 5. The Roots of Religion.
To an evolutionary psychologist, the universal extravagance of religious rituals with their costs in time, resources, pain and privation should suggest as vividly as a mandrill's bottom that religion may be adaptive. Marek Cohn.
The Darwinian Imperative. Everybody has their own pet theory of where religion comes from and why all human cultures have it. It gives consolation and comfort. It fosters togetherness in groups. It satisfies our yearning to understand why we exist. I shall come to explanations of this kind in a moment, but I want to begin with a prior question, one that takes precedence for reasons we shall see, a Darwinian question about natural selection.
Knowing that we are products of Darwinian evolution, we should ask what pressure or pressures exerted by natural selection originally favoured the impulse to religion. The question gains urgency from standard Darwinian considerations of economy. Religion is so wasteful, so extravagant, and Darwinian selection habitually targets and eliminates waste. Nature is a miserly accountant, grudging the pennies, watching the clock, punishing the smallest extravagance. Unrelentingly and unceasingly, as Darwin explained,
natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working, whenever and wherever opportunity offers, at the improvement of each organic being.
If a wild animal habitually performs some useless activity, natural selection will favour rival individuals who devote the time and energy instead to surviving and reproducing. Nature cannot afford frivolous jeux d'esprit. Ruthless utilitarianism trumps, even if it doesn't always seem that way. On the face of it, the tail of a peacock is a jeu d'esprit par excellence. It surely does no favours to the survival of its possessor. But it does benefit the genes that distinguish him from his less spectacular rivals. The tail is an advertisement, which buys its place in the economy of nature by attracting females. The same is true of the labour and time that a male bowerbird devotes to his bower, a sort of external tail built of grass, twigs, colourful berries, flowers, and, when available, beads, baubles, and bottle caps. Or to choose an example that doesn't involve advertising, there is anting, the odd habit of birds such as jays of bathing in an ant's nest or otherwise applying ants to the feathers. Nobody's sure what the benefit of anting is. Perhaps some kind of hygiene, cleaning out parasites from the feathers. There are various other hypotheses, none of them strongly supported by evidence. But uncertainty as to details doesn't, nor should it, stop Darwinians from presuming with great confidence that anting must be for something. In this case, common sense might agree, but Darwinian logic has a particular reason for thinking that if the birds didn't do it, their statistical prospects of genetic success would be damaged, even if we don't yet know the precise root of the damage. The conclusion follows from the twin premises that natural selection punishes wastage of time and energy, and that birds are consistently observed to devote time and energy to anting. If there is a one-sentence manifesto of this adaptationist principle, it was expressed, admittedly in somewhat extreme and exaggerated terms, by the distinguished Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin.
That is the one point which I think all evolutionists are agreed upon, that it is virtually impossible to do a better job than an organism is doing in its own environment.
If anting wasn't positively useful for survival and reproduction, natural selection would long ago have favoured individuals who refrained from it. A Darwinian might be tempted to say the same of religion, hence the need for this discussion. To an evolutionist, religious rituals stand out like peacocks in a sunlit glade, Dan Dennett's phrase. Religious behaviour is a writ large human equivalent of anting or bower building. It is time-consuming, energy-consuming, often as extravagantly ornate as the plumage of a bird of paradise. Religion can endanger the life of the pious individual, as well as the lives of others. Thousands of people have been tortured for their loyalty to a religion, persecuted by zealots for what is, in many cases, a scarcely distinguishable alternative faith. Religion devours resources, sometimes on a massive scale. A medieval cathedral could consume 100 man-centuries in its construction, yet was never used as a dwelling or for any recognizably useful purpose. Was it some kind of architectural peacock's tail? If so, at whom was the advertisement aimed? Sacred music and devotional paintings largely monopolized medieval and Renaissance talent. Devout people have died for their gods and killed for them, whipped blood from their backs, sworn themselves to a lifetime of celibacy or to lonely silence, all in the service of religion. What is it all for? What is the benefit of religion?
By benefit, the Darwinian normally means some enhancement to the survival of the individual's genes. What is missing from this is the important point that Darwinian benefit is not restricted to the genes of the individual organism. There are three possible alternative targets of benefit. One arises from the theory of group selection, and I'll come to that. The second follows from the theory that I advocated in The Extended Phenotype. The individual you are watching may be working under the manipulative influence of genes in another individual, perhaps a parasite. Dan Dennett reminds us that the common cold is universal to all human peoples in much the same way as religion is, yet we would not want to suggest that colds benefit us. Plenty of examples are known of animals manipulated into behaving in such a way as to benefit the transmission of a parasite to its next host. I encapsulated the point in my central theorem of the extended phenotype. An animal's behavior tends to maximize the survival of the genes for that behavior, whether or not those genes happen to be in the body of the particular animal performing it. Third, the central theorem may substitute for genes the more general term replicators. The fact that religion is ubiquitous probably means that it has worked to the benefit of something, but it may not be us or our genes. It may be to the benefit of only the religious ideas themselves, to the extent that they behave in a somewhat gene-like way as replicators. I shall deal with this below under the heading Tread Softly, because you tread on my memes. Meanwhile, I press on with more traditional interpretations of Darwinism, in which benefit is assumed to mean benefit to individual survival and reproduction.
Hunter-gatherer peoples, such as Australian Aboriginal tribes, presumably live in something like the way our distant ancestors did. The New Zealand-Australian philosopher of science Kim Sterelny points up a dramatic contrast in their lives. On the one hand, Aboriginals are superb survivors under conditions that test their practical skills to the uttermost. But Sterelny goes on, intelligent as our species might be, we are perversely intelligent. The very same peoples who are so savvy about the natural world and how to survive in it, simultaneously clutter their minds with beliefs that are palpably false, and for which the word useless is a generous understatement. Sterelny himself is familiar with Aboriginal peoples of Papua New Guinea. They survive under arduous conditions where food is hard to come by dint of
a legendarily accurate understanding of their biological environment. But they combine this understanding with deep and destructive obsessions about female menstrual pollution and about witchcraft. Many of the local cultures are tormented by fears of witchcraft and magic, and by the violence that accompanies those fears.
Sterelny challenges us to explain
how we can be simultaneously so smart and so dumb.
Though the details differ across the world, no known culture lacks some version of the time-consuming, wealth-consuming, hostility-provoking rituals, the anti-factual, counterproductive fantasies of religion. Some educated individuals may have abandoned religion, but all were brought up in a religious culture from which they usually had to make a conscious decision to depart. The old Northern Ireland joke, "Yes, but are you a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist?" is spiked with bitter truth. Religious behavior can be called a human universal in the same way as heterosexual behavior can. Both generalizations allow individual exceptions, but all those exceptions understand only too well the rule from which they have departed. Universal features of a species demand a Darwinian explanation. Obviously there is no difficulty in explaining the Darwinian advantage of sexual behavior. It is about making babies, even on those occasions where contraception or homosexuality seems to belie it. But what about religious behavior? Why do humans fast, kneel, genuflect, self-flagellate, nod maniacally towards a wall, crusade, or otherwise indulge in costly practices that can consume life and, in extreme cases, terminate it?
Direct advantages of religion. There is a little evidence that religious belief protects people from stress-related diseases. The evidence is not strong, but it would not be surprising if it were true for the same kind of reason as faith healing might turn out to work in a few cases. I wish it were not necessary to add that such beneficial effects in no way boost the truth value of religious claims. In George Bernard Shaw's words,
"The fact that a believer is happier than a skeptic is no more to the point than the fact that a drunken man is happier than a sober one."
Part of what a doctor can give a patient is consolation and reassurance. This is not to be dismissed out of hand. My doctor doesn't literally practice faith healing by laying on of hands, but many's the time I've been instantly cured of some minor ailment by a reassuring voice from an intelligent face surmounting a stethoscope. The placebo effect is well documented, and not even very mysterious. Dummy pills with no pharmacological activity at all demonstrably improve health. That is why double-blind drug trials must use placebos as controls. It's why homeopathic remedies appear to work, even though they are so dilute that they have the same amount of active ingredient as the placebo control, 0 molecules. Incidentally, an unfortunate byproduct of the encroachment by lawyers on doctors' territory is that doctors are now afraid to prescribe placebos in normal practice. Or bureaucracy may oblige them to identify the placebo in written notes, to which the patient has access, which of course defeats the object. Homeopaths may be achieving relative success because they, unlike orthodox practitioners, are still allowed to administer placebos under another name. They also have more time to devote to talking and simply being kind to the patient. In the early part of its long history, moreover, homeopathy's reputation was inadvertently enhanced by the fact that its remedies did nothing at all, by contrast with orthodox medical practices, such as bloodletting, which did active harm. Is religion a placebo that prolongs life by reducing stress? Possibly, although the theory must run a gauntlet of skeptics who point out the many circumstances in which religion causes rather than relieves stress. It's hard to believe, for example, that health is improved by the semi-permanent state of morbid guilt suffered by a Roman Catholic, possessed of normal human frailty and less than normal intelligence. Perhaps it's unfair to single out the Catholics. The American comedian Kathy Ladman observes that
all religions are the same. Religion is basically guilt with different holidays.
In any case, I find the placebo theory unworthy of the massively pervasive worldwide phenomenon of religion. I don't think the reason we have religion is that it reduced the stress levels of our ancestors. That's not a big enough theory for the job, although it may have played a subsidiary role. Religion is a large phenomenon, and it needs a large theory to explain it. Other theories miss the point of Darwinian explanations altogether. I'm talking about suggestions like, religion satisfies our curiosity about the universe and our place in it, or religion is consoling. There may be some psychological truth here, as we shall see in Chapter 10, but neither is in itself a Darwinian explanation. As Steven Pinker pointedly said of the consolation theory in How the Mind Works,
it only raises the question of why a mind would evolve to find comfort in beliefs it can plainly see are false. A freezing person finds no comfort in believing he is warm. A person face to face with a lion is not put at ease by the conviction that it is a rabbit.
At the very least, the consolation theory needs to be translated into Darwinian terms, and that is harder than you might think. Psychological explanations to the effect that people find some belief agreeable or disagreeable are proximate, not ultimate explanations. Darwinians make much of this distinction between proximate and ultimate. The proximate explanation for the explosion in the cylinder of an internal combustion engine invokes the sparking plug. The ultimate explanation concerns the purpose for which the explosion was designed, to impel a piston from the cylinder, thereby turning a crankshaft. The proximate cause of religion might be hyperactivity in a particular node of the brain. I shall not pursue the neurological idea of a God center in the brain, because I'm not concerned here with proximate questions. That is not to belittle them. I recommend Michael Shermer's How We Believe, The Search for God in an Age of Science, for a succinct discussion, which includes the suggestion by Michael Persinger and others that visionary religious experiences are related to temporal lobe epilepsy. But my preoccupation in this chapter is with Darwinian ultimate explanations. If neuroscientists find a God center in the brain, Darwinian scientists like me will still want to understand the natural selection pressure that favored it. Why did those of our ancestors who had a genetic tendency to grow a God center survive to have more grandchildren than rivals who didn't? The Darwinian ultimate question is not a better question, not a more profound question, not a more scientific question than the neurological proximate question, but it is the one I am talking about here.
Nor are Darwinians satisfied by political explanations, such as, religion is a tool used by the ruling class to subjugate the underclass. It is surely true that black slaves in America were consoled by promises of another life, which blunted their dissatisfaction with this one and thereby benefited their owners. The question of whether religions are deliberately designed by cynical priests or rulers is an interesting one, to which historians should attend, but it is not in itself a Darwinian question. The Darwinian still wants to know why people are vulnerable to the charms of religion and therefore open to exploitation by priests, politicians, and kings. A cynical manipulator might use sexual lust as a tool of political power, but we still need the Darwinian explanation of why it works. In the case of sexual lust, the answer is easy. Our brains are set up to enjoy sex because sex, in the natural state, makes babies. Or a political manipulator might use torture to achieve his ends. Once again, the Darwinian must supply the explanation for why torture is effective, why we will do almost anything to avoid intense pain. Again, it seems obvious to the point of banality, but the Darwinian still needs to spell it out. Natural selection has set up the perception of pain as a token of life-threatening bodily damage and programmed us to avoid it. Those rare individuals who cannot feel pain or don't care about it usually die young of injuries which the rest of us would have taken steps to avoid. Whether it is cynically exploited or whether it just manifests itself spontaneously, what ultimately explains the lust for gods? Group selection. Some alleged ultimate explanations turn out to be, or avowedly are, group selection theories. Group selection is the controversial idea that Darwinian selection chooses among species or other groups of individuals. The Cambridge archaeologist Colin Renfrew suggests that Christianity survived by a form of group selection because it fostered the idea of in-group loyalty and in-group brotherly love, and this helped religious groups to survive at the expense of less religious groups. The American group selection apostle D.S. Wilson independently developed a similar suggestion at more length in Darwin's Cathedral. Here's an invented example to show what a group selection theory of religion might look like. A tribe, with a stirringly belligerent god of battles, wins wars against rival tribes whose gods urge peace and harmony, or tribes with no gods at all. Warriors who unshakably believe that a martyr's death will send them straight to paradise fight bravely and willingly give up their lives. So tribes with this kind of religion are more likely to survive in intertribal warfare, steal the conquered tribe's livestock, and seize their women as concubines. Such successful tribes prolifically spawn daughter tribes that go off and propagate more daughter tribes, all worshipping the same tribal god. The idea of a group spawning daughter groups like a beehive throwing off swarms is not implausible, by the way. The anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon mapped just such fissioning of villages in his celebrated study of the fierce people, the Yanomamo of the South American jungle.
Chagnon is not a supporter of group selection, and nor am I. There are formidable objections to it. A partisan in the controversy, I must beware of riding off on my pet steed tangent far from the main track of this book. Some biologists betray a confusion between true group selection as in my hypothetical example of the god of battles, and something else which they call group selection, but which turns out on closer inspection to be either kin selection or reciprocal altruism. See Chapter 6. Those of us who belittle group selection admit that in principle it can happen. The question is whether it amounts to a significant force in evolution. When it is pitted against selection at lower levels, as when group selection is advanced as an explanation for individual self-sacrifice, lower-level selection is likely to be stronger. In our hypothetical tribe, imagine a single self-interested warrior in an army dominated by aspiring martyrs eager to die for the tribe and earn a heavenly reward. He will be only slightly less likely to end up on the winning side as a result of hanging back in the battle to save his own skin. The martyrdom of his comrades will benefit him more than it benefits each one of them on average, because they will be dead. He is more likely to reproduce than they are, and his genes for refusing to be martyred are more likely to be reproduced into the next generation. Hence, tendencies towards martyrdom will decline in future generations. This is a simplified toy example, but it illustrates a perennial problem with group selection. Group selection theories of individual self-sacrifice are always vulnerable to subversion from within. Individual deaths and reproductions occur on a faster time scale and with greater frequency than group extinctions and fissionings. Mathematical models can be crafted to come up with special conditions under which group selection might be evolutionarily powerful. These special conditions are usually unrealistic in nature, but it can be argued that religions in human tribal groupings foster just such otherwise unrealistic special conditions. This is an interesting line of theory, but I shall not pursue it here, except to concede that Darwin himself, though he was normally a staunch advocate of selection at the level of the individual organism, came as close as he ever came to group selectionism in his discussion of human tribes.
When two tribes of primeval man, living in the same country, came into competition, if the one tribe included, other circumstances being equal, a greater number of courageous, sympathetic and faithful members, who were always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other, this tribe would, without doubt, succeed best and conquer the other. Selfish and contentious people will not cohere, and without coherence, nothing can be effected. A tribe possessing the above qualities in a high degree would spread and be victorious over other tribes. But in the course of time it would, judging from all past history, be in turn overcome by some other and still more highly endowed tribe.
To satisfy any biological specialists who might be reading this, I should add that Darwin's idea was not strictly group selection, in the true sense of successful groups spawning daughter groups whose frequency might be counted in a meta-population of groups. Rather, Darwin visualized tribes with altruistically cooperative members spreading and becoming more numerous in terms of numbers of individuals. Darwin's model is more like the spread of the grey squirrel in Britain at the expense of the red, ecological replacement, not true group selection. Religion as a byproduct of something else. In any case, I want now to set aside group selection and turn to my own view of the Darwinian survival value of religion. I am one of an increasing number of biologists who see religion as a byproduct of something else. More generally, I believe that we who speculate about Darwinian survival value need to think byproduct. When we ask about the survival value of anything, we may be asking the wrong question. We need to rewrite the question in a more helpful way. Perhaps the feature we're interested in, religion in this case, doesn't have a direct survival value of its own, but is a byproduct of something else that does. I find it helpful to introduce the byproduct idea with an analogy from my own field of animal behavior.
Moths fly into the candle flame, and it doesn't look like an accident. They go out of their way to make a burnt offering of themselves. We could label it self-immolation behavior, and under that provocative name wonder how on earth natural selection could favor it. The point is that we must rewrite the question before we can even attempt an intelligent answer. It isn't suicide. Apparent suicide emerges as an inadvertent side effect or byproduct of something else. A byproduct of What? Well, here's one possibility which will serve to make the point. Artificial light is a recent arrival on the night scene. Until recently, the only night lights on view were the moon and the stars. They are at optical infinity, so rays coming from them are parallel. This fits them for use as compasses. Insects are known to use celestial objects such as the sun and the moon to steer accurately in a straight line, and they can use the same compass with reversed sign for returning home after a foray. The insect nervous system is adept at setting up a temporary rule of thumb of this kind. Steer a course such that the light rays hit your eye at an angle of 30 degrees. Since insects have compound eyes, with straight tubes or light guides radiating out from the center of the eye like the spines of a hedgehog, this might amount in practice to something as simple as keeping the light in one particular tube, or ommatidium. But the light compass relies critically on the celestial object being at optical infinity. If it isn't, the rays are not parallel, but diverge like the spokes of a wheel. A nervous system applying a 30-degree, or any acute angle, rule of thumb to a nearby candle, as though it were the moon at optical infinity, will steer the moth, via a spiral trajectory, into the flame. Draw it out for yourself, using some particular acute angle such as 30 degrees, and you'll produce an elegant logarithmic spiral into the candle. Though fatal in this particular circumstance, the moth's rule of thumb is still, on average, a good one because, for a moth, sightings of candles are rare compared with sightings of the moon. We don't notice the hundreds of moths that are silently and effectively steering by the moon or a bright star, or even the glow from a distant city. We see only moths wheeling into our candle, and we ask the wrong question: why are all these moths committing suicide? Instead, we should ask why they have nervous systems that steer by maintaining a fixed angle to light rays, a tactic that we notice only when it goes wrong. When the question is rephrased, the mystery evaporates. It never was right to call it suicide. It is a misfiring byproduct of a normally useful compass. Now, apply the byproduct lesson to religious behavior in humans. We observe large numbers of people, in many areas it amounts to 100%, who hold beliefs that flatly contradict demonstrable scientific facts, as well as rival religions followed by others. People not only hold these beliefs with passionate certitude, but devote time and resources to costly activities that flow from holding them. They die for them, or kill for them. We marvel at this just as we marveled at the self-immolation behavior of the moths. Baffled, we ask why. But the point is that we may be asking the wrong question. The religious behavior may be a misfiring, an unfortunate byproduct of an underlying psychological propensity which in other circumstances is, or once was, useful. On this view, the propensity that was naturally selected in our ancestors was not religion per se. It had some other benefit, and it only incidentally manifests itself as religious behavior. We shall understand religious behavior only after we have renamed it.
If then religion is a byproduct of something else, what is that something else? What is the counterpart to the moth habit of navigating by celestial light compasses? What is the primitively advantageous tray that sometimes misfires to generate religion? I shall offer one suggestion by way of illustration, but I must stress that it is only an example of the kind of thing I mean, and I shall come on to parallel suggestions made by others. I am much more wedded to the general principle that the question should be properly put, and if necessary rewritten, than I am to any particular answer. My specific hypothesis is about children. More than any other species, we survive by the accumulated experience of previous generations, and that experience needs to be passed on to children for their protection and well-being. Theoretically, children might learn from personal experience not to go too near a cliff edge, not to eat untried red berries, not to swim in crocodile-infested waters. But, to say the least, there will be a selective advantage to child brains that possess the rule of thumb: believe without question whatever your grown-ups tell you. Obey your parents, obey the tribal elders. especially when they adopt a solemn, minatory tone. Trust your elders without question. This is a generally valuable rule for a child. But as with the moths, it can go wrong. I have never forgotten a horrifying sermon preached in my school chapel when I was little. Horrifying in retrospect, that is. At the time, my child brain accepted it in the spirit intended by the preacher. He told us a story of a squad of soldiers drilling beside a railway line. At a critical moment, the drill sergeant's attention was distracted, and he failed to give the order to halt. The soldiers were so well schooled to obey orders without question that they carried on marching right into the path of an oncoming train. Now, of course, I don't believe the story, and I hope the preacher didn't either, but I believed it when I was 9, because I heard it from an adult in authority over me. And whether he believed it or not, the preacher wished us children to admire and model ourselves on the soldier's slavish and unquestioning obedience to an order, however preposterous, from an authority figure. Speaking for myself, I think we did admire it. As an adult, I find it almost impossible to credit that my childhood self wondered whether I would have had the courage to do my duty by marching under the train. But that, for what it is worth, is how I remember my feelings. The sermon obviously made a deep impression on me, for I have remembered it and passed it on to you. To be fair, I don't think the preacher thought he was serving up a religious message. It was probably more military than religious, in the spirit of Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, which he may well have quoted.
Forward the Light Brigade! Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldiers knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600.
One of the earliest and scratchiest recordings of the human voice ever made is of Lord Tennyson himself reading this poem, and the impression of hollow declaiming down a long, dark tunnel from the depths of the past seems eerily appropriate. From the High Command's point of view, it would be madness to allow each individual soldier discretion over whether or not to obey orders. Nations whose infantrymen act on their own initiative, rather than following orders, will tend to lose wars. From the nation's point of view, this remains a good rule of thumb, even if it sometimes leads to individual disasters. Soldiers are drilled to become as much like automata, or computers, as possible.
Computers do what they are told. They slavishly obey any instructions given in their own programming language. This is how they do useful things like word processing and spreadsheet calculations. But, as an inevitable byproduct, they are equally robotic in obeying bad instructions. They have no way of telling whether an instruction will have a good effect or a bad. They simply obey as soldiers are supposed to. It is their unquestioning obedience that makes computers useful, and exactly the same thing makes them inescapably vulnerable to infection by software viruses and worms. A maliciously designed program that says, "Copy me and send me to every address that you find on this hard disk," will simply be obeyed, and then obeyed again by the other computers down the line to which it is sent in exponential expansion. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to design a computer which is usefully obedient and at the same time immune to infection.
If I've done my softening up work well, you will already have completed my argument about child brains and religion. Natural selection builds child brains with a tendency to believe whatever their parents and tribal elders tell them. Such trusting obedience is valuable for survival, the analogue of steering by the moon for a moth. But the flip side of trusting obedience is slavish gullibility. The inevitable byproduct is vulnerability to infection by mind viruses. For excellent reasons related to Darwinian survival, child brains need to trust parents and elders whom parents tell them to trust. An automatic consequence is that the truster has no way of distinguishing good advice from bad. The child cannot know that "don't paddle in the crocodile-infested Limpopo" is good advice, but "you must sacrifice a goat at the time of the full moon, otherwise the rains will fail" is at best a waste of time and goats. Both admonitions sound equally trustworthy. Both come from a respected source and are delivered with a solemn earnestness that commands respect and demands obedience. The same goes for propositions about the world, about the cosmos, about morality, and about human nature. And very likely, when the child grows up and has children of her own, she will naturally pass the whole lot on to her own children, nonsense as well as sense, using the same infectious gravitas of manner. On this model, we should expect that in different geographical regions, different arbitrary beliefs, none of which have any factual basis, will be handed down to be believed with the same conviction as useful pieces of traditional wisdom, such as the belief that manure is good for the crops. We should also expect that superstitions and other non-factual beliefs will locally evolve, change over generations, either by random drift or by some sort of analogue of Darwinian selection, eventually showing a pattern of significant divergence from common ancestry. Languages drift apart from a common progenitor, given sufficient time in geographical separation. I shall return to this point in a moment. The same seems to be true of baseless and arbitrary beliefs and injunctions handed down the generations, beliefs that were perhaps given a fair wind by the useful programmability of the child brain. Religious leaders are well aware of the vulnerability of the child brain and the importance of getting the indoctrination in early. The Jesuit boast,
"Give me the child for his first 7 years, and I'll give you the man,"
is no less accurate or sinister for being hackneyed. In more recent times, James Dobson, founder of today's infamous Focus on the Family movement, is equally acquainted with the principle.
"Those who control what young people are taught and what they experience, what they see, hear, think, and believe, will determine the future course for the nation."
But remember, my specific suggestion about the useful gullibility of the child mind is only an example of the kind of thing that might be the analogue of moths navigating by the moon or the stars. The ethologist Robert Hind in Why Gods Persist, and the anthropologists Pascal Boyer in Religion Explained, and Scott Atran in Gods We Trust, have independently promoted the general idea of religion as a byproduct of normal psychological dispositions. Many byproducts, I should say, for the anthropologists especially, are concerned to emphasize the diversity of the world's religions, as well as what they have in common. The findings of anthropologists seem weird to us only because they are unfamiliar. All religious beliefs seem weird to those not brought up in them. Boyer did research on the Fang people of Cameroon, who believe
that witches have an extra internal, animal-like organ that flies away at night and ruins other people's crops, or poisons their blood. It is also said that these witches sometimes assemble for huge banquets, where they devour their victims and plan future attacks. Many will tell you that a friend of a friend actually saw witches flying over the village at night, sitting on a banana leaf and throwing magical darts at various unsuspecting victims.
Boyer continues with a personal anecdote.
"I was mentioning these and other exotica over dinner in a Cambridge college, when one of our guests, a prominent Cambridge theologian, turned to me and said, 'That is what makes anthropology so fascinating and so difficult too. You have to explain how people can believe such nonsense,' which left me dumbfounded. The conversation had moved on before I could find a pertinent response to do with kettles and pots."
Assuming that the Cambridge theologian was a mainstream Christian, he probably believed some combination of the following.
In the time of the ancestors, a man was born to a virgin mother with no biological father being involved. The same fatherless man called out to a friend called Lazarus, who'd been dead long enough to stink, and Lazarus promptly came back to life. The fatherless man himself came alive after being dead and buried 3 days. 40 days later, the fatherless man went up to the top of a hill and then disappeared bodily into the sky. If you murmur thoughts privately in your head, the fatherless man and his father, who is also himself, will hear your thoughts and may act upon them. He is simultaneously able to hear the thoughts of everybody else in the world. If you do something bad or something good, the same fatherless man sees all, even if nobody else does. You may be rewarded or punished accordingly, including after your death. The fatherless man's virgin mother never died, but ascended bodily into heaven. Bread and wine, if blessed by a priest, who must have testicles, become the body and blood of the fatherless man.
What would an objective anthropologist coming fresh to this set of beliefs while on field work in Cambridge make of them? Psychologically primed for religion. The idea of psychological byproducts grows naturally out of the important and developing field of evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that, just as the eye is an evolved organ for seeing and the wing an evolved organ for flying, so the brain is a collection of organs, or modules, for dealing with a set of specialist data processing needs. There is a module for dealing with kinship, a module for dealing with reciprocal exchanges, a module for dealing with empathy, and so on. Religion can be seen as a byproduct of the misfiring of several of these modules. For example, the modules for forming theories of other minds, for forming coalitions, and for discriminating in favor of in-group members and against strangers. Any of these could serve as the human equivalent of the moth's celestial navigation, vulnerable to misfiring in the same kind of way as I suggested for childhood gullibility. The psychologist Paul Bloom, another advocate of the religion is a byproduct view, points out that children have a natural tendency towards a dualistic theory of mind. Religion, for him, is a byproduct of such instinctive dualism. We humans, he suggests, and especially children, are natural-born dualists.
A dualist acknowledges a fundamental distinction between matter and mind. A monist, by contrast, believes that mind is a manifestation of matter, material in a brain or perhaps a computer, and cannot exist apart from matter. A dualist believes the mind is some kind of disembodied spirit that inhabits the body and therefore conceivably could leave the body and exist somewhere else. Dualists readily interpret mental illness as possession by devils, those devils being spirits whose residence in the body is temporary, such that they might be cast out. Dualists personify inanimate physical objects at the slightest opportunity, seeing spirits and demons even in waterfalls and clouds. F. Anstey's 1882 novel Vice Versa makes sense to a dualist, but strictly should be incomprehensible to a dyed-in-the-wool monist like most scientists. Mr. Bultitude and his son mysteriously find that they have swapped bodies. The father, much to the son's glee, is obliged to go to school in the son's body, while the son, in the father's body, almost ruins the father's business through his immature decisions. A similar plotline was used by P.G. Wodehouse in Laughing Gas, where the Earl of Havershot and a child movie star go under the anaesthetic at the same moment in neighbouring dentist chairs and wake up in each other's bodies. Once again, the plot makes sense only to a dualist. There has to be something corresponding to Lord Havershot which is no part of his body, otherwise how could he wake up in the body of a child actor?
I am not a dualist, but I am nevertheless easily capable of enjoying Vice Versa and Laughing Gas. Paul Bloom would say that is because, even though I have learned to be an intellectual monist, I am a human animal and therefore evolved as an instinctive dualist. The idea that there is a me perched somewhere behind my eyes and capable, at least in fiction, of migrating into somebody else's head is deeply ingrained in me and in every other human being, whatever our intellectual pretensions to monism. Bloom supports his contention with experimental evidence that children are even more likely to be dualists than adults are, especially extremely young children. This suggests that a tendency to dualism is built into the brain and, according to Bloom, provides a natural predisposition to embrace religious ideas.
Bloom also suggests that we are innately predisposed to be creationists. Natural selection makes no intuitive sense. Children are especially likely to assign purpose to everything, as the psychologist Deborah Kellerman tells us in her article, Are Children Intuitive Theists? Clouds are for raining. Pointy rocks are so that animals could scratch on them when they get itchy. The assignment of purpose to everything is called teleology. Children are native teleologists, and many never grow out of it. Native dualism and native teleology predispose us, given the right conditions, to religion, just as the moth's light compass reaction predisposed them to inadvertent suicide. Our innate dualism prepares us to believe in a soul which inhabits the body rather than being integrally part of the body. Such a disembodied spirit can easily be imagined to move on somewhere else after the death of the body. We can also easily imagine the existence of a deity as pure spirit, not an emergent property of complex matter, but existing independently of matter. Even more obviously, childish teleology sets us up for religion. If everything has a purpose, whose purpose is it? God's, of course.
But what is the counterpart of the usefulness of the moth's light compass? Why might natural selection have favoured dualism and teleology in the brains of our ancestors and their children? So far, my account of the innate dualist theory has simply posited that humans are natural-born dualists and teleologists. But what would the Darwinian advantage be? Predicting the behaviour of entities in our world is important for our survival, and we would expect natural selection to have shaped our brains to do it efficiently and fast. Might dualism and teleology serve us in this capacity? We may understand this hypothesis better in the light of what the philosopher Daniel Dennett has called the intentional stance. Dennett has offered a helpful three-way classification of the stances that we adopt in trying to understand, and hence predict, the behaviour of entities such as animals, machines, or each other. They are the physical stance, the design stance, and the intentional stance. The physical stance always works in principle because everything ultimately obeys the laws of physics. But working things out using the physical stance can be very slow. By the time we have sat down to calculate all the interactions of a complicated object's moving parts, our prediction of its behaviour will probably be too late. For an object that really is designed, like a washing machine or a crossbow, the design stance is an economical shortcut. We can guess how the object will behave by going over the head of physics and appealing directly to design. As Dennett says,
almost anyone can predict when an alarm clock will sound on the basis of the most casual inspection of its exterior. One does not know or care to know whether it is spring-wound, battery-driven, sunlight-powered, made of brass wheels and jewel bearings, or silicon chips. One just assumes that it is designed so that the alarm will sound when it is set to sound.
Living things are not designed, but Darwinian natural selection licenses a version of the design stance for them. We get a short cut to understanding the heart if we assume that it is designed to pump blood. Carl von Frisch was led to investigate colour vision in bees, in the face of orthodox opinion that they were colour-blind, because he assumed that the bright colours of flowers were designed to attract them. The quotation marks are designed to scare off mendacious creationists who might otherwise claim the great Austrian zoologist as one of their own. Needless to say, he was perfectly capable of translating the design stance into proper Darwinian terms.
The intentional stance is another shortcut, and it goes one better than the design stance. An entity is assumed not merely to be designed for a purpose, but to be or contain an agent with intentions that guide its actions. When you see a tiger, you had better not delay your prediction of its probable behaviour. Never mind the physics of its molecules, and never mind the design of its limbs, claws, and teeth. That cat intends to eat you, and it will deploy its limbs, claws, and teeth in flexible and resourceful ways to carry out its intention. The quickest way to second-guess its behaviour is to forget physics and physiology and cut to the intentional chase. Note that just as the design stance works even for things that were not actually designed as well as things that were, so the intentional stance works for things that don't have deliberate conscious intentions as well as things that do.
It seems to me entirely plausible that the intentional stance has survival value as a brain mechanism that speeds up decision-making in dangerous circumstances and in crucial social situations. It is less immediately clear that dualism is a necessary concomitant of the intentional stance. I shan't pursue the matter here, but I think a case could be developed that some kind of theory of other minds, which could fairly be described as dualistic, is likely to underlie the intentional stance, especially in complicated social situations and even more especially where higher-order intentionality comes into play.
Dennett speaks of third-order intentionality. The man believed that the woman knew he wanted her. Fourth order, the woman realized that the man believed that the woman knew he wanted her. And even fifth-order intentionality. The shaman guessed that the woman realized that the man believed that the woman knew he wanted her. Very high orders of intentionality are probably confined to fiction, as satirized in Michael Frayn's hilarious novel The Tin Men.
Watching Nonopoulos, Rick knew that he was almost certain that Anna felt a passionate contempt for Fiddling Child's failure to understand her feelings about Fiddling Child, and she knew too that Nina knew she knew about Nonopoulos' knowledge.
But the fact that we can laugh at such contortions of other mind inference in fiction is probably telling us something important about the way our minds have been naturally selected to work in the real world. In its lower orders at least, the intentional stance, like the design stance, saves time that might be vital to survival. Consequently, natural selection shaped brains to deploy the intentional stance as a shortcut. We are biologically programmed to impute intentions to entities whose behavior matters to us. Once again, Paul Bloom quotes experimental evidence that children are especially likely to adopt the intentional stance. When small babies see an object apparently following another object, for example on a computer screen, they assume that they are witnessing an active chase by an intentional agent, and they demonstrate the fact by registering surprise when the putative agent fails to pursue the chase.
The design stance and the intentional stance are useful brain mechanisms, important for speeding up the second-guessing of entities that really matter for survival, such as predators or potential mates. But like other brain mechanisms, these stances can misfire. Children and primitive peoples impute intentions to the weather, to waves and currents, to falling rocks. All of us are prone to do the same thing with machines, especially when they let us down. Many will remember with affection the day Basil Fawlty's car broke down during his vital mission to save Gourmet Night from disaster. He gave it fair warning, counted to 3, then got out of the car, seized a tree branch and thrashed it to within an inch of its life. Most of us have been there, at least momentarily with a computer if not with a car. Justin Barrett coined the acronym HAD for Hyperactive Agent Detection Device. We hyperactively detect agents where there are none, and this makes us suspect malice or benignity where, in fact, nature is only indifferent. I catch myself momentarily harbouring savage resentment against some blameless inanimate, such as my bicycle chain. There was a poignant recent report of a man who tripped over his untied shoelace in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, fell down the stairs, and smashed 3 priceless Qing dynasty vases.
He landed in the middle of the vases, and they splintered into 1,000,000 pieces. He was still sitting there, stunned, when staff appeared. Everyone stood around in silence, as if in shock. The man kept pointing to his shoelace, saying, "There it is. That's the culprit."
Other byproduct explanations of religion have been proposed by Hind, Schirmer, Boyer, Atran, Bloom, Dennett, Kellerman, and others. One especially intriguing possibility mentioned by Dennett is that the irrationality of religion is a byproduct of a particular built-in irrationality mechanism in the brain, our tendency, which presumably has genetic advantages, to fall in love.
The anthropologist Helen Fisher, in Why We Love, has beautifully expressed the insanity of romantic love, and how over the top it is compared with what might seem strictly necessary. Look at it this way. From the point of view of a man, say, it is unlikely that any one woman of his acquaintance is 100 times more lovable than her nearest competitor, yet that is how he is likely to describe her when in love. Rather than the fanatically monogamous devotion to which we're susceptible, some sort of polyamory is on the face of it more rational. Polyamory is the belief that one can simultaneously love several members of the opposite sex, just as one can love more than one wine, composer, book, or sport. We happily accept that we can love more than one child, parent, sibling, teacher, friend, or pet. When you think of it like that, isn't the total exclusiveness that we expect of spousal love positively weird? Yet it is what we expect, and it is what we set out to achieve. There must be a reason.
Helen Fisher and others have shown that being in love is accompanied by unique brain states, including the presence of neurally active chemicals, in effect natural drugs, that are highly specific and characteristic of the state. Evolutionary psychologists agree with her that the irrational coup de foudre could be a mechanism to ensure loyalty to one co-parent, lasting for long enough to rear a child together. From a Darwinian point of view, it is no doubt important to choose a good partner for all sorts of reasons, but once having made a choice, even a poor one, and conceived a child, it is more important to stick with that one choice through thick and thin, at least until the child is weaned. Could irrational religion be a byproduct of the irrationality mechanisms that were originally built into the brain by selection for falling in love? Certainly, religious faith has something of the same character as falling in love, and both have many of the attributes of being high on an addictive drug. The neuropsychiatrist John Smithies cautions that there are significant differences between the brain areas activated by the two kinds of mania. Nevertheless, he notes some similarities too.
One facet of the many faces of religion is intense love focused on one supernatural person, i.e. God, plus reverence for icons of that person. Human life is driven largely by our selfish genes and by the processes of reinforcement. Much positive reinforcement derives from religion, warm and comforting feelings of being loved and protected in a dangerous world, loss of fear of death, help from the hills in response to prayer in difficult times, etc. Likewise, romantic love for another real person, usually of the other sex, exhibits the same intense concentration on the other and related positive reinforcements. These feelings can be triggered by icons of the other, such as letters, photographs, and even, as in Victorian times, locks of hair. The state of being in love has many physiological accompaniments, such as sighing like a furnace.
I made the comparison between falling in love and religion in 1993, when I noted that the symptoms of an individual infected by religion may be startlingly reminiscent of those more ordinarily associated with sexual love. This is an extremely potent force in the brain, and it is not surprising that some viruses have evolved to exploit it. Viruses here is a metaphor for religions. My article was called Viruses of the Mind. St. Teresa of Avila's famously orgasmic vision is too notorious to need quoting again. More seriously, and on a less crudely sensual plane, the philosopher Anthony Kenny provides moving testimony to the pure delight that awaits those who manage to believe in the mystery of the transubstantiation. After describing his ordination as a Roman Catholic priest, empowered by laying on of hands to celebrate Mass, he goes on that he vividly recalls
the exaltation of the first months during which I had the power to say Mass. Normally a slow and sluggish riser, I would leap early out of bed, fully awake and full of excitement at the thought of the momentous act I was privileged to perform. It was touching the body of Christ, the closeness of the priest to Jesus, which most enthralled me. I would gaze on the host after the words of consecration, soft-eyed like a lover looking into the eyes of his beloved. Those early days as a priest remain in my memory as days of fulfillment and tremulous happiness, something precious and yet too fragile to last, like a romantic love affair brought up short by the reality of an ill-assorted marriage.
The equivalent of the moth's light compass reaction is the apparently irrational but useful habit of falling in love with one, and only one, member of the opposite sex. The misfiring byproduct, equivalent to flying into the candle flame, is falling in love with Yahweh, or with the Virgin Mary, or with a wafer, or with Allah, and performing irrational acts motivated by such love. The biologist Lewis Wolpert, in 6 Impossible Things Before Breakfast, makes a suggestion that can be seen as a generalization of the idea of constructive irrationality. His point is that irrationally strong conviction is a guard against fickleness of mind.
If beliefs that saved lives were not held strongly, it would have been disadvantageous in early human evolution. It would be a severe disadvantage, for example, when hunting or making tools, to keep changing one's mind.
The implication of Wolpert's argument is that, at least under some circumstances, it is better to persist in an irrational belief than to vacillate, even if new evidence or ratiocination favours a change. It is easy to see the falling in love argument as a special case, and it is correspondingly easy to see Wolpert's irrational persistence as yet another useful psychological predisposition that could explain important aspects of irrational religious behaviour, yet another byproduct. In his book Social Evolution, Robert Trivers enlarged on his 1976 evolutionary theory of self-deception. Self-deception is
hiding the truth from the conscious mind, the better to hide it from others. In our own species, we recognize that shifty eyes, sweaty palms, and croaky voices may indicate the stress that accompanies conscious knowledge of attempted deception. By becoming unconscious of its deception, the deceiver hides these signs from the observer. He or she can lie without the nervousness that accompanies deception.
The anthropologist Lionel Tiger says something similar in Optimism, the Biology of Hope. The connection to the sort of constructive irrationality we have just been discussing is seen in Trivers's paragraph about perceptual defense.
There is a tendency for humans consciously to see what they wish to see. They literally have difficulty seeing things with negative connotations, while seeing with increasing ease items that are positive. For example, words that evoke anxiety, either because of an individual's personal history or because of experimental manipulation, require greater illumination before first being perceived.
The relevance of this to the wishful thinking of religion should need no spelling out. The general theory of religion as an accidental byproduct, a misfiring of something useful, is the one I wish to advocate. The details are various, complicated, and disputable. For the sake of illustration, I shall continue to use my gullible child theory as representative of byproduct theories in general. This theory, that the child brain is, for good reasons, vulnerable to infection by mental viruses, will strike some readers as incomplete. Vulnerable the mind may be, but why should it be infected by this virus rather than that? Are some viruses especially proficient at infecting vulnerable minds? Why does infection manifest itself as religion rather than as, well, what? Part of what I want to say is that it doesn't matter what particular style of nonsense infects the child brain. Once infected, the child will grow up and infect the next generation with the same nonsense, whatever it happens to be.
An anthropological survey, such as Fraser's Golden Bough, impresses us with the diversity of irrational human beliefs. Once entrenched in a culture, they persist, evolve, and diverge in a manner reminiscent of biological evolution. Yet Fraser discerns certain general principles, for example, homeopathic magic, whereby spells and incantations borrow some symbolic aspect of the real-world object they're intended to influence. An instance with tragic consequences is the belief that powdered rhinoceros horn has aphrodisiac properties. Fatuous as it is, the legend stems from the horn's supposed resemblance to a virile penis. The fact that homeopathic magic is so widespread suggests that the nonsense that infects vulnerable brains is not entirely random, arbitrary nonsense. It is tempting to pursue the biological analogy to the point of wondering whether something corresponding to natural selection is at work. Are some ideas more spreadable than others because of intrinsic appeal or merit or compatibility with existing psychological dispositions, and could this account for the nature and properties of actual religions as we see them, in something like the way we use natural selection to account for living organisms? It is important to understand that merit here means only ability to survive and spread. It doesn't mean deserving of a positive value judgment, something of which we might be humanly proud. Even on an evolutionary model, there doesn't have to be any natural selection. Biologists acknowledge that a gene may spread through a population not because it is a good gene, but simply because it is a lucky one. We call this genetic drift. How important it is vis-à-vis natural selection has been controversial, but it is now widely accepted in the form of the so-called neutral theory of molecular genetics. If a gene mutates to a different version of itself, which has an identical effect, the difference is neutral, and selection cannot favour one or the other. Nevertheless, by what statisticians call sampling error over generations, the new mutant form can eventually replace the original form in the gene pool. This is a true evolutionary change at the molecular level, even if no change is observed in the world of whole organisms. It is a neutral, evolutionary change that owes nothing to selective advantage.
The cultural equivalent of genetic drift is a persuasive option, one that we cannot neglect when thinking about the evolution of religion. Language evolves in a quasi-biological way, and the direction its evolution takes looks undirected, pretty much like random drift. It is handed down by a cultural analogue of genetics, changing slowly over the centuries until eventually various strands have diverged to the point of mutual unintelligibility. It is possible that some of the evolution of language is guided by a kind of natural selection, but that argument doesn't seem very persuasive. I'll explain below that some such idea has been proposed for major trends in language, like the great vowel shift which took place in English from the 15th to the 18th century. But such a functional hypothesis is not necessary to explain most of what we observe. It seems probable that language normally evolves by the cultural equivalent of random genetic drift. In different parts of Europe, Latin drifted to become Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, Romansh, and the various dialects of these languages. It is, to say the least, not obvious that these evolutionary shifts reflect local advantages or selection pressures. I surmise that religions, like languages, evolve with sufficient randomness from beginnings that are sufficiently arbitrary to generate the bewildering, and sometimes dangerous, richness of diversity that we observe. At the same time, it is possible that a form of natural selection, coupled with the fundamental uniformity of human psychology, sees to it that the diverse religions share significant features in common. Many religions, for example, teach the objectively implausible but subjectively appealing doctrine that our personalities survive our bodily death. The idea of immortality itself survives and spreads because it caters to wishful thinking, and wishful thinking counts because human psychology has a near universal tendency to let belief be coloured by desire.
There seems to be no doubt that many of the attributes of religion are well fitted to helping the religion's own survival and the survival of the attributes concerned in the stew of human culture. The question now arises of whether the good fit is achieved by intelligent design or by natural selection. The answer is probably both. On the side of design, religious leaders are fully capable of verbalizing the tricks that aid the survival of religion. Martin Luther was well aware that reason was religion's archenemy, and he frequently warned of its dangers.
Reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. It never comes to the aid of spiritual things, but more frequently than not struggles against the divine word, treating with contempt all that emanates from God.
Again,
whoever wants to be a Christian should tear the eyes out of his reason.
And again,
reason should be destroyed in all Christians.
Luther would have had no difficulty in intelligently designing unintelligent aspects of a religion to help it survive. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he or anyone else did design it. It could also have evolved by a non-genetic form of natural selection, with Luther not its designer, but a shrewd observer of its efficacy.
Even though conventional Darwinian selection of genes might have favoured psychological predispositions that produced religion as a byproduct, it is unlikely to have shaped the details. I have already hinted that, if we are going to apply some form of selection theory to those details, we should look not to genes, but to their cultural equivalents. Are religions such stuff as memes are made on? Tread softly, because you tread on my memes.
Truth, in matters of religion, is simply the opinion that has survived. Oscar Wilde.
This chapter began with the observation that, because Darwinian natural selection abhors waste, any ubiquitous features of a species, such as religion, must have conferred some advantage, or it wouldn't have survived. But I hinted that the advantage doesn't have to redound to the survival or reproductive success of the individual. As we saw, advantage to the genes of the cold virus sufficiently explains the ubiquity of that miserable complaint among our species. And it doesn't even have to be genes that benefit. Any replicator will do. Genes are only the most obvious examples of replicators. Other candidates are computer viruses and memes, units of cultural inheritance, and the topic of this section. If we are to understand memes, we have first to look a little more carefully at exactly how natural selection works. In its most general form, natural selection must choose between alternative replicators. A replicator is a piece of coded information that makes exact copies of itself, along with occasional inexact copies or mutations. The point about this is the Darwinian one. Those varieties of replicator that happen to be good at getting copied become more numerous at the expense of alternative replicators that are bad at getting copied. That, at its most rudimentary, is natural selection. The archetypal replicator is a gene, a stretch of DNA that is duplicated, nearly always with extreme accuracy, through an indefinite number of generations. The central question for meme theory is whether there are units of cultural imitation which behave as true replicators like genes. I am not saying that memes necessarily are close analogues of genes, only that the more like genes they are, the better will meme theory work, and the purpose of this section is to ask whether meme theory might work for the special case of religion.
In the world of genes, the occasional flaws in replication, mutations, see to it that the gene pool contains alternative variants of any given gene, alleles, which may therefore be seen as competing with each other. Competing for what? For the particular chromosomal slot or locus that belongs to that set of alleles. And how do they compete? Not by direct molecule-to-molecule combat, but by proxy. The proxies are their phenotypic traits, things like leg length or fur color, manifestations of genes fleshed out as anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, or behavior. A gene's fate is normally bound up with the bodies in which it successively sits. To the extent that it influences those bodies, it affects its own chances of surviving in the gene pool. As the generations go by, genes increase or decrease in frequency in the gene pool by virtue of their phenotypic proxies. Might the same be true of memes? One respect in which they are not like genes is that there is nothing obviously corresponding to chromosomes or loci, or alleles or sexual recombination. The meme pool is less structured and less organized than the gene pool. Nevertheless, it's not obviously silly to speak of a meme pool, in which particular memes might have a frequency which can change as a consequence of competitive interactions with alternative memes. Some people have objected to memetic explanations on various grounds that usually stem from the fact that memes are not entirely like genes. The exact physical nature of a gene is now known. It is a sequence of DNA, whereas that of memes is not, and different memeticists confuse one another by switching from one physical medium to another. Do memes exist only in brains? Or is every paper copy and electronic copy of, say, a particular limerick also entitled to be called a meme? Then again, genes replicate with very high fidelity, whereas if memes replicate at all, don't they do so with low accuracy? These alleged problems of memes are exaggerated. The most important objection is the allegation that memes are copied with insufficiently high fidelity to function as Darwinian replicators. The suspicion is that if the mutation rate in every generation is high, the meme will mutate itself out of existence before Darwinian selection can have an impact on its frequency in the meme pool. But the problem is illusory. Think of a master carpenter or a prehistoric flint knapper demonstrating a particular skill to a young apprentice. If the apprentice faithfully reproduced every hand movement of the master, you would indeed expect to see the meme mutate out of all recognition in a few generations of master-apprentice transmission. But of course the apprentice does not faithfully reproduce every hand movement. It would be ridiculous to do so. Instead, He notes the goal that the master is trying to achieve and imitates that. Drive in the nail until the head is flush, using as many hammer blows as it takes, which may not be the same number as the master used. It is such rules that can pass unmutated down an indefinite number of imitation generations, no matter that the details of their execution may vary from individual to individual and from case to case. Stitches in knitting, knots in ropes or fishing nets, origami folding patterns, useful tricks in carpentry or pottery, all can be reduced to discrete elements that really do have the opportunity to pass down an indefinite number of imitation generations without alteration. The details may wander idiosyncratically, but the essence passes down unmutated, and that is all that is needed for the analogy of memes with genes to work.
In my foreword to Susan Blackmore's The Meme Machine, I developed the example of an origami procedure for making a model Chinese junk. It's quite a complicated recipe involving 32 folding or similar operations. The end result, the Chinese junk itself, is a pleasing object, as are at least 3 intermediate stages in the embryology, namely the catamaran, the box with 2 lids, and the picture frame. The whole performance does indeed remind me of the foldings and invaginations that the membranes of an embryo undergo as it morphs itself from blastula to gastrula to neurula. I learned to make the Chinese junk as a boy from my father, who at about the same age had acquired the skill at his boarding school. A craze for making Chinese junks, initiated by the school matron, had spread through the school in his time like a measles epidemic, then died away also like a measles epidemic. 26 years later, when that matron was long gone, I went to the same school. I reintroduced the craze, and it again spread like another measles epidemic, and then again died away. The fact that such a teachable skill can spread like an epidemic tells us something important about the high fidelity of memetic transmission. We may be sure that the junks made by my father's generation of schoolboys in the 1920s were in no general respect different from those made by my generation in the 1950s.
We could investigate the phenomenon more systematically by the following experiment. A variant of the childhood game of Chinese whispers. American children call it telephone. Take 200 people who've never made a Chinese junk before and line them up in 20 teams of 10 people each. Gather the heads of the 20 teams around a table and teach them, by demonstration, how to make a Chinese junk. Now send each one off to find the second person in his own team and teach that person alone, again by demonstration, to make a Chinese junk. Each second generation person then teaches the third person in her own team, and so on, until the 10th member of every team has been reached. Keep all the junks made along the way and label them by their team and generation number for subsequent inspection.
I haven't done the experiment yet, I'd like to, but I have a strong prediction of what the result will be. My prediction is that not all of the 20 teams will succeed in passing the skill intact down the line to their 10th members, but that a significant number of them will. In some of the teams there will be mistakes. Perhaps a weak link in the chain will forget some vital step in the procedure, and everyone downstream of the mistake will then obviously fail. Perhaps Team 4 gets as far as the catamaran, but falters thereafter. Perhaps the 8th member of Team 13 produces a mutant somewhere between the box with 2 lids and the picture frame, and the 9th and 10th members of his team then copy the mutated version. Now, of those teams in which the skill is transferred successfully to the 10th generation, I make a further prediction. If you rank the junks in order of generation, you will not see a systematic deterioration of quality with generation number. If, on the other hand, you were to run an experiment identical in all respects except that the skill transferred was not origami but copying a drawing of a junk, there would definitely be a systematic deterioration in the accuracy with which the Generation 1 pattern survived to Generation 10.
In the drawing version of the experiment, all the Generation 10 drawings will bear some slight resemblance to the Generation 1 drawing, and within each team the resemblance would more or less steadily deteriorate as you proceed down the generations. In the origami version of the experiment, by contrast, the mistakes would be all or none. They'd be digital mutations. Either a team would make no mistakes, and the Generation 10 junk would be no worse and no better on average than that produced by Generation 5 or Generation 1, or there would be a mutation in some particular generation, and all downstream efforts would be complete failures, often faithfully reproducing the mutation. What is the crucial difference between the two skills? It is that the origami skill consists of a series of discrete actions, none of which is difficult to perform in itself. Mostly the operations are things like fold both sides into the middle. A particular team member may execute the step ineptly, but it will be clear to the next team member down the line what he is trying to do. The origami steps are self-normalizing. It is this that makes them digital. It is like the master carpenter, whose intention to flatten the nail head in the wood is obvious to his apprentice, regardless of the details of the hammer blows. Either you get a given step of the origami recipe right, or you don't. The drawing skill, by contrast, is an analog skill. Everybody can have a go, but some people copy a drawing more accurately than others, and nobody copies it perfectly. The accuracy of the copy depends, too, on the amount of time and care devoted to it, and these are continuously variable quantities. Some team members, moreover, will embellish and improve, rather than strictly copy, the preceding model. Words, at least when they're understood, are self-normalizing in the same kind of way as origami operations. In the original game of Chinese whispers, telephone, the first child is told a story, or a sentence, and is asked to pass it on to the next child, and so on. If the sentence is less than about 7 words in the native language of all the children, there is a good chance that it will survive, unmutated, down 10 generations. If it is an unknown foreign language, so that the children are forced to imitate phonetically rather than word by word, the message does not survive. The pattern of decay down the generations is then the same as for a drawing, and it will become garbled. When the message makes sense in the children's own language and doesn't contain any unfamiliar words like phenotype or allele, it survives. Instead of mimicking the sounds phonetically, each child recognizes each word as a member of a finite vocabulary and selects the same word, although very probably pronounced in a different accent, when passing it on to the next child. Written language is also self-normalizing because the squiggles on paper, no matter how much they may differ in detail, are all drawn from a finite alphabet of, say, 26 letters.
The fact that memes can sometimes display very high fidelity due to self-normalizing processes of this kind is enough to answer some of the commonest objections that are raised to the meme-gene analogy. In any case, the main purpose of meme theory at this early stage of its development is not to supply a comprehensive theory of culture on a par with Watson-Crick genetics. My original purpose in advocating memes, indeed, was to counter the impression that the gene was the only Darwinian game in town, an impression that the selfish gene was otherwise at risk of conveying. Peter Richardson and Robert Boyd emphasize the point in the title of their valuable and thoughtful book, Not by Genes Alone, although they give reasons for not adopting the word meme itself, preferring cultural variants. Stephen Shannon's Genes, Memes and Human History was partly inspired by an earlier, excellent book by Boyd and Richardson, Culture and the Evolutionary Process. Other book-length treatments of memes include Robert Ornger's The Electric Meme, Kate Distin's The Selfish Meme, and Virus of the Mind, The New Science of the Meme, by Richard Brodie. But it is Susan Blackmore in The Meme Machine who has pushed memetic theory further than anyone. She repeatedly visualizes a world full of brains, or other receptacles or conduits, such as computers or radio frequency bands, and memes jostling to occupy them. As with genes in a gene pool, the memes that prevail will be the ones that are good at getting themselves copied. This may be because they have direct appeal, as presumably the immortality meme has for some people, or it may be because they flourish in the presence of other memes that have already become numerous in the meme pool. This gives rise to meme complexes or memeplexes. As usual with memes, we gain understanding by going back to the genetic origin of the analogy. For didactic purposes, I treated genes as though they were isolated units acting independently. But of course, they are not independent of one another, and this fact shows itself in two ways. First, genes are linearly strung along chromosomes, and so tend to travel through generations in the company of particular other genes that occupy neighboring chromosomal loci. We doctors call that kind of linkage, and I shall say no more about it because memes don't have chromosomes, alleles, or sexual recombination. The other respect in which genes are not independent is very different from genetic linkage, and here there is a good memetic analogy. It concerns embryology, which, the fact is often misunderstood, is completely distinct from genetics. Bodies are not jigsawed together as mosaics of phenotypic pieces, each one contributed by a different gene. There is no one-to-one mapping between genes and units of anatomy or behavior. Genes collaborate with hundreds of other genes in programming the developmental processes that culminate in a body, in the same kind of way as the words of a recipe collaborate in a cookery process that culminates in a dish. It is not the case that each word of the recipe corresponds to a different morsel of the dish.
Genes then cooperate in cartels to build bodies, and that is one of the important principles of embryology. It is tempting to say that natural selection favors cartels of genes in a kind of group selection between alternative cartels. That is confusion. What really happens is that the other genes of the gene pool constitute a major part of the environment in which each gene is selected versus its alleles. Because each is selected to be successful in the presence of the others, which are also being selected in a similar way, cartels of cooperating genes emerge. We have here something more like a free market than a planned economy. There is a butcher and a baker, but perhaps a gap in the market for a candlestick maker. The invisible hand of natural selection fills the gap. That is different from having a central planner who favors the troika of butcher plus baker plus candlestick maker. The idea of cooperating cartels assembled by the invisible hand will turn out to be central to our understanding of religious memes and how they work.
Different kinds of gene cartel emerge in different gene pools. Carnivore gene pools have genes that program prey-detecting sense organs, prey-catching claws, carnassial teeth, meat-digesting enzymes, and many other genes, all fine-tuned to cooperate with each other. At the same time, in herbivore gene pools, different sets of mutually compatible genes are favored for their cooperation with each other. We are familiar with the idea that a gene is favored for the compatibility of its phenotype with the external environment of the species, desert, woodland, or whatever it is. The point I am now making is that it is also favored for its compatibility with the other genes of its particular gene pool. A carnivore gene would not survive in a herbivore gene pool, and vice versa. In the long gene's eye view, the gene pool of the species, the set of genes that are shuffled and reshuffled by sexual reproduction, constitutes the genetic environment in which each gene is selected for its capacity to cooperate. Although meme pools are less regimented and structured than gene pools, we can still speak of a meme pool as an important part of the environment of each meme in the memeplex. A memeplex is a set of memes which, while not necessarily being good survivors on their own, are good survivors in the presence of other members of the memeplex. In the previous section, I doubted that the details of language evolution are favored by any kind of natural selection. I guessed that language evolution is instead governed by random drift. It is just conceivable that certain vowels or consonants carry better than others through mountainous terrain, and therefore might become characteristic of, say, Swiss, Tibetan, or Andean dialects, while other sounds are suitable for whispering in dense forests, and are therefore characteristic of Pygmy and Amazonian languages. But the one example I cited of language being naturally selected, the theory that the great vowel shift might have a functional explanation, is not of this type. Rather, it has to do with memes fitting in with mutually compatible memeplexes. One vowel shifted first for reasons unknown, perhaps fashionable imitation of an admired or powerful individual, as is alleged to be the origin of the Spanish lisp. Never mind how the great vowel shift started. According to this theory, once the first vowel had changed, other vowels had to shift in its train to reduce ambiguity, and so on in cascade. In this second stage of the process, memes were selected against the background of already existing meme pools, building up a new memeplex of mutually compatible memes. We are finally equipped to turn to the memetic theory of religion. Some religious ideas, like some genes, might survive because of absolute merit. These memes would survive in any meme pool, regardless of the other memes that surround them. I must repeat the vitally important point that merit, in this sense, means only ability to survive in the pool. It carries no value judgment apart from that. Some religious ideas survive because they are compatible with other memes that are already numerous in the meme pool, as part of a memeplex. The following is a partial list of religious memes that might plausibly have survival value in the meme pool, either because of absolute merit or because of compatibility with an existing memeplex.
You will survive your own death.
If you die a martyr, you will go to an especially wonderful part of paradise, where you will enjoy 72 virgins. Spare a thought for the unfortunate virgins.
Heretics, blasphemers, and apostates should be killed, or otherwise punished, for example by ostracism from their families.
Belief in God is a supreme virtue. If you find your belief wavering, work hard at restoring it, and beg God to help your unbelief. In my discussion of Pascal's wager, I mentioned the odd assumption that the one thing God really wants of us is belief. At the time I treated it as an oddity. Now we have an explanation for it.
Faith, belief without evidence, is a virtue. The more your beliefs defy the evidence, the more virtuous you are. Virtuoso believers who can manage to believe something really weird, unsupported and insupportable, in the teeth of evidence and reason, are especially highly rewarded.
Everybody, even those who do not hold religious beliefs, must respect them with a higher level of automatic and unquestioned respect than that accorded to other kinds of belief.
There are some weird things, such as the Trinity, transubstantiation, incarnation, that we are not meant to understand. Don't even try to understand one of these, for the attempt might destroy it. Learn how to gain fulfillment in calling it a mystery.
Beautiful music, art, and scriptures are themselves self-replicating tokens of religious ideas. Different schools and genres of art can be analyzed as alternative memeplexes, as artists copy ideas and motifs from earlier artists, and new motifs survive only if they mesh with others. Indeed, the whole academic discipline of history of art, with its sophisticated tracing of iconographies and symbolisms, could be seen as an elaborate study in memplexity. Details will have been favored or disfavored by the presence of existing members of the meme pool, and these will often include religious memes.
Some of the above list probably have absolute survival value and would flourish in any memeplex. But, as with genes, some memes survive only against the right background of other memes, leading to the build-up of alternative memeplexes. Two different religions might be seen as two alternative memeplexes. Perhaps Islam is analogous to a carnivorous gene complex, Buddhism to a herbivorous one. The ideas of one religion are not better than those of the other in any absolute sense, any more than carnivorous genes are better than herbivorous ones. Religious memes of this kind don't necessarily have any absolute aptitude for survival. Nevertheless, they are good in the sense that they flourish in the presence of other memes of their own religion, but not in the presence of memes of the other religion. On this model, Roman Catholicism and Islam, say, were not necessarily designed by individual people, but evolved separately as alternative collections of memes that flourish in the presence of other members of the same memeplex.
Organized religions are organized by people, by priests and bishops, rabbis, imams, and ayatollahs. But to reiterate the point I made with respect to Martin Luther, that doesn't mean they were conceived and designed by people. even where religions have been exploited and manipulated to the benefit of powerful individuals, the strong possibility remains that the detailed form of each religion has been largely shaped by unconscious evolution. Not by genetic natural selection, which is too slow to account for the rapid evolution and divergence of religions. The role of genetic natural selection in the story is to provide the brain with its predilections and biases, the hardware platform and low-level system software which forms the background to memetic selection. Given this background, memetic natural selection of some kind seems to me to offer a plausible account of the detailed evolution of particular religions. In the early stages of a religion's evolution, before it becomes organized, simple memes survive by virtue of their universal appeal to human psychology. This is where the meme theory of religion and the psychological byproduct theory of religion overlap. The later stages, where a religion becomes organized, elaborate, and arbitrarily different from other religions, are quite well handled by the theory of memeplexes, cartels of mutually compatible memes. This doesn't rule out the additional role of deliberate manipulation by priests and others. Religions probably are, at least in part, intelligently designed, as are schools and fashions in art. One religion that was intelligently designed, almost in its entirety, is Scientology, but I suspect that it is exceptional. Another candidate for a purely designed religion is Mormonism. Joseph Smith, its enterprisingly mendacious inventor, went to the lengths of composing a complete new holy book, the Book of Mormon, inventing from scratch a whole new bogus American history written in bogus 17th century English. Mormonism, however, has evolved since it was fabricated in the 19th century and has now become one of the respectable mainstream religions of America. Indeed, it claims to be the fastest-growing one, and there is talk of fielding a presidential candidate. Most religions evolve. Whatever theory of religious evolution we adopt, it has to be capable of explaining the astonishing speed with which the process of religious evolution, given the right conditions, can take off. A case study follows.
Cargo cults. In the life of Brian, one of the many things the Monty Python teen got right was the extreme rapidity with which a new religious cult can get started. It can spring up almost overnight, and then become incorporated into a culture where it plays a disquietingly dominant role. The cargo cults of Pacific Melanesia and New Guinea provide the most famous real-life example. The entire history of some of these cults, from initiation to expiry, is wrapped up within living memory. Unlike the cult of Jesus, the origins of which are not reliably attested, we can see the whole course of events laid out before our eyes, and even here, as we shall see, some details are now lost. It is fascinating to guess that the cult of Christianity almost certainly began in very much the same way, and spread initially at the same high speed.
My main authority for the cargo cults is David Attenborough's Quest in Paradise, which he very kindly presented to me. The pattern is the same for all of them, from the earliest cults in the 19th century to the more famous ones that grew up in the aftermath of the Second World War. It seems that in every case the islanders were bowled over by the wondrous possessions of the white immigrants to their islands, including administrators, soldiers, and missionaries. They were perhaps the victims of Arthur C. Clarke's Third Law, which I quoted in Chapter 2. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The islanders noticed that the white people who enjoyed these wonders never made them themselves. When articles needed repairing, they were sent away, and new ones kept arriving as cargo, in ships or later planes. No white man was ever seen to make or repair anything, nor indeed did they do anything that could be recognized as useful work of any kind. Sitting behind a desk shuffling papers was obviously some kind of religious devotion. Evidently, then, the cargo must be of supernatural origin. As if in corroboration of this, the white men did do certain things that could only have been ritual ceremonies.
They build tall masts with wires attached to them. They sit listening to small boxes that glow with light and emit curious noises and strangled voices. They persuade the local people to dress up in identical clothes and march them up and down, and it would hardly be possible to devise a more useless occupation than that. And then the native realizes that he has stumbled on the answer to the mystery. It is these incomprehensible actions that are the rituals employed by the white man to persuade the gods to send the cargo. If the native wants the cargo, then he too must do these things.
It is striking that similar cargo cults sprang up independently on islands that were widely separated both geographically and culturally. David Attenborough tells us that
anthropologists have noted 2 separate outbreaks in New Caledonia, 4 in the Solomons, 4 in Fiji, 7 in the New Hebrides, and over 50 in New Guinea, most of them being quite independent and unconnected with one another. The majority of these religions claim that one particular Messiah will bring the cargo when the day of the apocalypse arrives.
the independent flowering of so many independent but similar cults suggests some unifying features of human psychology in general. One famous cult on the island of Tanna in the New Hebrides, known as Vanuatu since 1980, is still extant. It is centered on a messianic figure called John Frum. References to John Frum in official government records go back only as far as 1940, but, even for so recent a myth, it is not known for certain whether he ever existed as a real man. One legend described him as a little man with a high-pitched voice and bleached hair, wearing a coat with shining buttons. He made strange prophecies, and he went out of his way to turn the people against the missionaries. Eventually, he returned to the ancestors, after promising a triumphal second coming, bearing bountiful cargo. His apocalyptic vision included a great cataclysm. The mountains would fall flat, and the valleys would be filled. Old people would regain their youth, and sickness would vanish. The white people would be expelled from the island, never to return. And cargo would arrive in great quantity, so that everybody would have as much as he wanted. Most worryingly for the government, John Frum also prophesied that, on his second coming, he would bring a new coinage stamped with the image of a coconut. The people must therefore get rid of all their money of the white man's currency. In 1941, this led to a wild spending spree. The people stopped working, and the island's economy was seriously damaged. The colonial administrators arrested the ringleaders, but nothing that they could do would kill the cult, and the mission churches and schools became deserted. A little later, a new doctrine grew up that John Frum was King of America. Providentially, American troops arrived in the New Hebrides around this time, and, wonder of wonders, they included black men, who were not poor like the islanders, but
as richly endowed with cargo as the white soldiers. Wild excitement overwhelmed Tanna. The day of the apocalypse was imminent. It seemed that everyone was preparing for the arrival of John Frum. One of the leaders said that John Frum would be coming from America by aeroplane, and hundreds of men began to clear the bush in the center of the island so that the plane might have an airstrip on which to land.
the airstrip had a bamboo control tower with air traffic controllers wearing dummy headphones made of wood. There were dummy planes on the runway to act as decoys, designed to lure down John Frum's plane. In the 1950s, the young David Attenborough sailed to Tanna with a cameraman, Geoffrey Mulligan, to investigate the cult of John Frum. They found plenty of evidence of the religion and were eventually introduced to its high priest, a man called Nambas. Nambas referred to his Messiah familiarly as John, and claimed to speak regularly to him by radio. This radio belonged John consisted of an old woman with an electric wire around her waist, who would fall into a trance and talk gibberish, which Nambas interpreted as the words of John Frum. Nambas claimed to have known in advance that Attenborough was coming to see him, because John Frum had told him on the radio. Attenborough asked to see the radio, but was, understandably, refused. He changed the subject, and asked whether Nambas had seen John Frum.
Nambas nodded vigorously. "Me see him plenty time." "What does he look like?" Nambas jabbed his finger at me. "He look like you. He got white face. He tall man. He live long South America."
This detail contradicts the legend referred to above, that John Frum was a short man. Such is the way with evolving legends. It is believed that the day of John Frum's return will be the 15th of February, but the year is unknown. Every year, on 15th of February, his followers assemble for a religious ceremony to welcome him. So far he has not returned, but they are not downhearted. David Attenborough said to one cult devotee called Sam,
"But Sam, it is 19 years since John say that the cargo will come. He promise and he promise, but still the cargo does not come. Isn't 19 years a long time to wait?" Sam lifted his eyes from the ground and looked at me. "If you can wait 2,000 years for Jesus Christ to come, and he no come, then I can wait more than 19 years for John."
Robert Buckman's book, Can We Be Good Without God, quotes the same admirable retort by a John Frum disciple, this time to a Canadian journalist some 40 years after David Attenborough's encounter. The Queen and Prince Philip visited the area in 1974, and the Prince subsequently became deified in a rerun of a John Frum-type cult. Once again, note how rapidly the details in religious evolution can change. The Prince is a handsome man who would have cut an imposing figure in his white naval uniform and plumed helmet, and it is perhaps not surprising that he, rather than the Queen, was elevated in this way, quite apart from the fact that the culture of the islanders made it difficult for them to accept a female deity. I don't want to make too much of the cargo cults of the South Pacific, but they do provide a fascinating contemporary model for the way religions spring up from almost nothing. In particular, they suggest 4 lessons about the origin of religions generally, and I'll set them out briefly here. First is the amazing speed with which a cult can spring up. Second is the speed with which the origination process covers its tracks. John Frum, if he existed at all, did so within living memory. Yet even for so recent a possibility, it is not certain whether he lived at all. The third lesson springs from the independent emergence of similar cults on different islands. The systematic study of these similarities can tell us something about human psychology and its susceptibility to religion. Fourth, the cargo cults are similar not just to each other, but to older religions. Christianity and other ancient religions that have spread worldwide presumably began as local cults like that of John Frum. Indeed, scholars such as Geza Vermesh, professor of Jewish studies at Oxford University, have suggested that Jesus was one of many such charismatic figures who emerged in Palestine around his time, surrounded by similar legends. Most of those cults died away. The one that survived on this view is the one that we encounter today. And as the centuries go by, it has been honed by further evolution, memetic selection if you like that way of putting it, not if you don't, into the sophisticated system, or rather diverging sets of descendant systems, that dominate large parts of the world today. The deaths of charismatic modern figures such as Haile Selassie, Elvis Presley, and Princess Diana offer other opportunities to study the rapid rise of cults and their subsequent memetic evolution. That is all I want to say about the roots of religion itself, apart from a brief reprise in Chapter 10, when I discuss the imaginary friend phenomenon of childhood, under the heading of the psychological needs that religion fulfills. Morality is often thought to have its roots in religion, and in the next chapter I want to question this view. I shall argue that the origin of morality can itself be the subject of a Darwinian question. Just as we asked, what is the Darwinian survival value of religion, so we can ask the same question of morality. Morality, indeed, probably predated religion. Just as with religion we drew back from the question and rephrased it, so with morality we shall find that it is best seen as a byproduct of something else.